Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second part of the webinar on business and human rights, a topic that we consider of critical importance for businesses committed to best practices and the key step for sustainable development. For those of you who missed the first part of the webinar that took place last year on 16 December, or would like to revisit it, the recording is available in our website, in our Institute YouTube channel, as today's webinar will be in a few days' time as well. For those who are joining us for the first time, I am Luisa Ferreira, Head of Social at the EIB Institute, and I will be your host for today's webinar. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers, Maria Folque and Francisco Granja de Almeida. Francisco was one of the speakers for part one of the webinar, both from the international law firm Vieira de Almeida and Associados, based in Lisbon, Portugal. Maria Folque is currently principal consultant and pro bono manager at VDA. Maria obtained her law degree from Nova University, Lisbon, Portugal, and a master's degree in global legal studies from Catholic University, also in Lisbon, Portugal, and Fordham University of New York, Faculty of Law. Francisco Granja de Almeida is an associate lawyer at VDA. Francisco obtained his law degree from the University of Lisbon and holds a Master of Laws in Public International Law from the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, where he specialized in human rights. They both currently work in VDA's social economy and human rights practice, where they cooperate with NGOs and advise businesses on their human rights responsibilities. They are, therefore, the right people to answer the questions you may have on the topic, and you'll have a chance to ask questions at the end of their presentation. I would just like to recall that in the first webinar on business and human rights, Francisco teamed up with Inês Vilar, and they set the scene on the topic and walked us through the legal landscape. They explored synergies between human rights and sustainability. They introduced fundamental concepts from a legal perspective, like human rights due diligence in 4 steps, and conducted a discussion about their impact and relevance for the future. In today's webinar, Marie and Francisco will go a step further from theory to practice, and they will present how to implement human rights due diligence. They will discuss how to identify significant human rights, how to implement relevant policies, and how to take action through specific due diligence mechanisms. I would like to point out that in 2020, European Commissioner for Justice, Commissioner Reinders, announced mandatory due diligence on human rights and the environment for companies of all sizes and in all sectors to be performed through the supply chain. It is expected that the legislation will be in force in 2022 or 2023. So this is a very topical webinar that Maria and Francisco will be sharing with us today. As I mentioned, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please write them in the chat box and use the option send to all panelists. They will try to answer all of them at the end of the webinar. Thank you, and now I invite Maria and Francisco to join us. Maria and Francisco, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Luisa, for this great presentation. And thank you once again, European Investment Bank Institute, for this great opportunity of being here today to talk about this topic for which Francisco and I share a great passion. We really believe that companies can make a better world by doing good for themselves while concerning about this topic, and this is what we are eager to share with you today. Circling back to what Louisa said in the last bit of her presentation, it is absolutely true. The things we're going to discuss today are still not mandatory, but they are going to be mandatory in very short term. And so we think it is of the interest of every company to get insights and learn about the expectations that communities and legislators have from them in terms of human rights protection and promotion. To give you an example, it is true that the European Directive on Human Rights Due Diligence is expected to be approved throughout this year, but just last Friday actually, Germany approved its legislation on human rights due diligence, and there are many other countries around the world who already have national legal instruments that bind companies and make them do things and report things in the area of human rights. Okay, so let's start. We thought about starting with tackling the myths. Yes, it's true. Basically, what Francisco and I feel when we discuss this topic is that there are still a few myths around the human rights, the business and human rights connection. And we think that it is important to clarify some of these myths. And so our proposal for today is to start by doing exactly that. So Francisco, over to you on the first myth.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Luisa and Maria, for your kind words in the presentation. My name is Francisco, and as Maria said, my first step here will be to introduce the first myth that we would like to tackle with you today. So, myth number one is that only the states and international organizations should be concerned with human rights. This clarification that we're going to follow now, it's a little of a circle back to our last webinar, just to give you the necessary introduction to follow the human rights due diligence process that we're going to move forward, especially because maybe not all of you had the opportunity to watch the first webinar. So if you want to dive deep into this topic, the first webinar, it's more prone to that elaboration. So first question is, what are human rights? The concept of human rights is as simple as it is powerful, that people are ought to be treated with dignity. So human rights are actually the international legal standards put in place to secure human dignity. They're basically the legal concretization of human dignity. So they are inherent to all human beings, whatever their nationality, place of residence, gender, national or ethnic origin, religion, or any other status. So they are inherent to everyone universally. Because every individual is entitled to enjoy human rights without discrimination, and because these are all interrelated and interdependent and indivisible, they vary from the right to freedom, the right to conscience, the right to religion, to the right to be free of torture. So human rights present themselves in a very large scope of what the state and international arena could reach to define what human dignity is. We vary from the right to life to the right of education, the right to religion, and the right to be free from torture. So for companies, as we will see throughout the presentation, the first big step is to identify where do we start, and that's our main goal here today as well. But as we've seen, human rights were conceived and formalized within the international community, in the international arena, which means that they were settled by international law that had as one of the main sources treaties. And companies who were not part of the treaties that bound the states together. So this is the first challenge that the international community had to face to make sure that there is a responsibility to protect human rights from business, is that businesses are typically not bound by international treaties that the states signed and ratified. So that was the number one issue. But the United Nations reacted to this, and in 2011, so a long time ago, it's not new, the United Nations approved the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is soft law legislation that is grounded in three major principles: the state duty to protect human rights, the corporate responsibility to protect human rights, and access to remedy. Today, we're focusing on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, which was established by the United Nations Guiding Principles in 2011. They are the first global due diligence rule that is applicable to every company of every size and sector. And they are still today the most authoritative framework on this matter. So Maria, do you think that every industry is under the UNGPs? There are industries that are more prone. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, Francisco. Now we would like to tackle the second myth. The second myth we bring to you today is that a lot of people still believe that only certain industries present real risks for corporate-related human rights violations. This is not true. So, although certain industries are indeed more prone to human rights violations, the key idea we would like you to leave today is that all businesses operating in every context have a responsibility towards protecting human rights. You would be surprised to see that even in some unsuspected industries, you may be contributing to human rights violations depending on your diligent procedures and your policies on these matters. For example, it was recently made public that even in the financial sector, which is a sector that you may not immediately associate with human rights violations, depending on the due diligence you make to vet your own clients, you may be contributing to human rights violation, depending on the people or entities that you decide to lend money to. However, and as mentioned earlier, you are absolutely right if you think that there are indeed certain industries that if you are part of them, you would be more worried, more concerned, especially aware of your responsibility and the risk, the higher risk that you have in directly or indirectly contributing to human rights violations. We will just run a few examples. The first example we have for you today is, of course, the mining industry, the mining sector. So here, the commonly associated human rights violations that you typically see are related to health and safety, displacement of indigenous people. This picture is a picture of a La Oroya case. La Oroya is in Peru, and basically this factory that operated in this beautiful place of Peru had as a consequence it put in jeopardy the health and the life and the integrity of its community. And only very late did the state intervene, and the factory was closed when a lot of damage was already done. So blood diamonds situations, for example, are also very well-known human rights violations related to this sector. We've probably all heard stories about it. So yes, indeed, if you are in this industry, if your company is within this industry, you should be specially concerned and specially aware of your responsibility to ensure that your operations and your relationship with your stakeholders doesn't put in jeopardy the people that people's human rights, the people who you work with, human rights. The next example you may probably have heard stories about is the agriculture sector. Okay, last year there was a very interesting interview, a series of interviews in Euronews about cases in this industry across Europe in different sectors of the agriculture industry. This picture is about the strawberries sector in Spain. And basically what happens here is because what you typically have in agriculture is that you may have the need to hire in certain periods of the year. So you may need seasonal workers for periods where you have more work with. What we have been acknowledging, unfortunately, is that the companies that hire these seasonal workers typically choose immigrants, vulnerable backgrounds people, and they don't give them the dignity and the labor and secure conditions that they would need to work. There's also stories of association with paramilitary groups, where basically there are companies in this sector that may hire paramilitary groups to protect their business interests at the cost of the community's human rights. And so this is typically another example of an industry that if you work with, either because your suppliers or business partners are in this industry or because your operations have directly to do with it, you should be especially aware and predisposed to address these issues we are tackling here today. The last example we would like to bring you today is, of course, the apparel industry. This is probably the most well-known example. We all know that international apparel brands have their suppliers in developing countries, and only a few years ago, most of them were completely unaware of the conditions of the workers of their suppliers. There was a big scandal in, I think, 2013, the collapse of the Rana Plaza building, where a lot of these international brand suppliers worked and had their people working, where basically what they did was for some time ignore the safety conditions of the building until to save costs, until one day the building just collapsed, a 9-story building, causing the death of thousands of workers, you can imagine, and injuries to 1,000 more. So typically, the apparel industry has been gaining a conscience that most of their suppliers that work in these developing countries may not treat their workers in the best of ways, or in the way the company would treat their own employees. And so they've been discovering that a lot of times, if they are not, if they don't watch out, and if they don't monitor adequately the situation, they will discover cases of modern slavery, child labor in their supply chains, and sometimes that can result in a major scandal and, of course, reputational damage to their brands. Okay, so now handling over to you, Francisco. I think that from these examples, you might be thinking that, okay, so I'm not a big corporation, and the industry examples you gave me suggest that maybe only big corporations should worry about their operations and in particular assess their value chains for human rights violation or to prevent and protect human rights within their value chain. But this is not the case, as Francisco is going to have the opportunity to tell you about just now.
Thank you, Maria. And you're precisely correct. Value chains are nowadays the biggest concern for companies, as supply chains are growing fast. They're fragmented through continents. The digitalization of markets is potentializing an economic growth within value chains. So thank you for that introduction. And it's exactly what we were trying to say before. The United Nations guiding principles are very clear that every business of every size and sector are under the duty to respect human rights. So this myth is clarified by the UNGPs that states very clearly that from every size, companies have a responsibility to protect human rights. But the UNGPs have a big dimension of the principle of proportionality, and they are aware that for some smaller companies to execute a total value chain assessment may be too difficult. So there is a reasonability criteria within the UNGPs that points to this idea that you're supposed to start with your salient human rights issues. So when you're facing a complex value chain, you have to start somewhere, and that is something that we're going to look up in a minute. But this is to say that although the United Nations guiding principles are clear that every business has the responsibility to respect human rights, in fact, local legislators and domestic examples have been pointing on another way. So although the UNGPs and their soft laws say every company, countries independently are regulating through a different scope. So somehow they will say that only big companies with more than 500 people are under the obligation to do a human rights due diligence. And if not big companies, all small and medium companies of high risk sectors. So the legislator, due to a concern of factuality and to actually be able to execute this due diligence, does create a scope of applicability. And that is important to say. This depends on every country where human rights legislation concerning businesses is already being applicable and is already mandatory. But this is an important dimension to note, especially because what we can predict from the European legislation that is coming soon, as Luisa and Maria already had the opportunity to disclaim, there is a European directive coming that aims on human rights due diligence, and that European directive actually diminishes the scope of every undertaking and every company to big companies and small and medium companies that are listed or in high risk sectors. So that is what we expect that the European legislator is going to move forward with. But this is not to say that, in fact, the United Nations guiding principles establish that every company has a duty to respect human rights. Maria, this was regarding the size and the dimension of corporations and how the UNGPs establish some criteria, but local legislations and countries independently are more prone to give smaller scopes. But what about other industries? What about the purpose of the corporations?
Yes, thank you, Francisco. We have a final myth to tackle here today, which was specially drafted for the social innovation tournament alumni community, which is composed by brilliant social entrepreneurs, also NGOs. What we would like to share with you today is that although many NGOs and social entrepreneurs think they may be exempt of human rights concerns, this is not the case. NGOs and social entrepreneurs are brilliant in a way that they've decided to identify and tackle a social or environmental challenge throughout an innovative, typically innovative business model, business intervention. However, the fact that they are tackling this environmental or social challenge does not mean that they should not be concerned and aware and address human rights risks within their operations or their value chain. One and the other are not the same thing, and this is something we would really like to end our first part of this presentation today. So from our experience working directly with the social sector, we tend to note that some large NGOs discredit their responsibility towards the promotion of human rights, and social entrepreneurs typically do not consider yet due diligence in their business models. From our point of view, this is not recommendable, although these organizations typically have, and we acknowledge that, strong social or environmental commitments that are reflected in their day-to-day operations. This added value to the society does not exempt them to prevent human rights issues by checking in their operations, their value chains, and so on, to ensure that they are not contributing directly or indirectly to human rights violations, and that they are in fact doing the opposite and promoting respect for human rights violations before all their stakeholders. Right, Francisco? What do you have to say about this ongoing process of due diligence that we've mentioned so many times now along the first part of our presentation? I think it's time that we dive a little bit deeper into that concept and let our listeners and our participants in this webinar understand a bit better what this is all about.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for that key, because that's exactly what we're going to move forward with now with the human rights due diligence. What does this mean? And we would like to give you these 3 words: ongoing management process. And if you leave this presentation with these 3 words connected to human rights due diligence, that will be a great win, because what we would like to tell you is that when your company is in practice developing human rights due diligence, this should be a continuum of best policies and practices that we're going to move forward and tell you in a while. And as we already spoke 2 times within this presentation, another disclaimer regarding the European directive that is coming, where human rights due diligence is broad, is demanding, and might be mandatory soon. So what we are going to talk next, it's going to be perhaps a reality for your company or social enterprise very soon. So keep up with the legislation, and this concept is going to be probably crucial to your business in a couple of months or years. But what is due diligence? Let's start with the fancy legal definition that is in the United Nations Guiding Principles by saying that due diligence is a measure of prudence, activity, or assiduity as is properly to be expected from and ordinarily exercised by a reasonable and prudent person under the particular circumstances. So it's not measured by any absolute standard, but depending on the relative facts of the special case. So in sum, due diligence is what could I have done to the best of my power in those circumstances. Regarding the United Nations Guiding Principles, it is defined by an ongoing management process that a reasonable and prudent enterprise needs to undertake in the light of its circumstances, including sector, operating context, size, and similar factors, to meet its responsibility to respect human rights. So in sum, when we're talking about human rights due diligence, we're talking of this ongoing management process where a company is doing everything to its power within its context to mitigate the risks of human rights violations, and in case of a violation, remedy the victims. So it's this balance between manage and also to communicate its impact, as we will see further on this presentation. And just like a car, human rights due diligence has 4 key components. So just like a car has the wheels, the engine, the doors, and independently of the multiple brands of cars that are in the world, there are 4 key components that it has to have. So does the human rights due diligence. And we would like to start by telling you what these 4 components are so that you can design and implement the best practices of your company, aware that these 4 dimensions are ought to be present. And these 4 components of human rights due diligence, in accordance to the United Nations Guiding Principles, are identifying actual or potential adverse human rights impacts. We've been talking about this key step throughout the presentation, and it's all about knowing where to start. Supply chains are long and complex. Human rights are interdependent, and they vary from freedom of torture to the right of education. So it might be daunting for a company to say, okay, so where is my ground zero? Where do I start? Do I have to implement human rights due diligence for every human rights violation, for every human right? The answer is, let's start with the salient human rights issues first. After this, we have to integrate findings across relevant company processes. So after we identify what actual potential adverse human rights impacts are, we integrate those findings across relevant company processes, and then we track its effectiveness and we communicate its impact. So this is a quick overview of the 4, but let me dive in the first key step of identifying actual or potential adverse human rights impacts, and we'll circle back to this very shortly. So we wrote this as a key step because from our experience, when we talk about human rights due diligence, it seems very daunting to companies because, well, if human rights vary from right to be free from torture, right to be not to be arbitrarily killed, right to education, right to health. So where do I begin? My value chains are so complex. I have 300 suppliers. Where do I start? So the UNGPs are very clear on how to deal with this initial anxiety of where to start human rights due diligence. You have to start with the most salient risks first. Those that within your business context are more at risk of human rights violations. And how do you do this? So business context might be your industry, the geographies where your business operates, and the concrete operations that your business does. So you look at your context that you know better than anybody, and this is why we always say that human rights due diligence is ought to be customized to the operation, to the industry, to the geography, to the context of the business. And then you use 3 main criteria. And those 3 criteria are scale, scope, and irremediability. These are the 3 criteria that you use to identify your salient human rights issues. And to do so, scale is all about the gravity. So you may think that The freedom to association is important, and there might be some risks that somewhere along your value chain, the freedom of association is not being upheld, but you're aware that modern slavery conditions is the crucial human rights importance, and that is impacting the human rights with severeness. This is not to say that some human rights are more important than others. They are not. They are equally important and interdependent, but still you have to look in a degree assessment and try to assess the scale of the impact. And if in a scale lens, modern slavery or child labor or human trafficking are the most great impact, that's where you should start. That's one of the criteria. The other one is more simple, is scope. So imagine that throughout your company, 3 people may have had the right to manifest impacted by your business, but actually there are thousands operating in factories where modern slavery conditions might be present. Therefore, following the scope criteria, modern slavery is where you should start. That's the human rights issue that you should be looking at first, because it's the most preeminent. It impacts more people. It's a quantitative criteria, and in contrast to the scale criteria, which is more subjective. Irremediability amounts to the fact that some human rights are more hard to remedy than others. If your freedom, going back to the freedom of association, if the freedom of association was blocked for a week, you can try to compensate and say, we're sorry, here's all the conditions you have to freely associate. But if your mental health, your physical health, or actually in worst case scenarios, the life of one of your workers was affected, those human rights are forever impacted. So there are no ways of remediate sometimes the right to health, as we've seen in the Loroya case that Maria presented. Those people in the Loroya community were impacted by lead intoxication throughout their entire lives. So that's another criteria, is that the human right to health is harder to remedy than the human right to association within my business context. So we're going to circle back to this and make this even more practical in the following slides. But this is a key step. Know where to start. Know your salient human rights issues. After you've done this, you take your findings and you integrate it across relevant company processes, such as human rights policy, training your people, understanding how you're going to contract with suppliers. And after this, you track the effectiveness of measures. And here is where training is very, very important, because you want to make sure that this is being secured. And this is where you want to do assessments to what was already done. After this, the idea of tracking and monitor the effectiveness of measures, you want to communicate your impacts. And we're going to see this further on how you can do this, but it's all about letting your stakeholders know that you've been that you are committed to the diligence and that you've been diligent when upholding human rights. So it's all about communicating and saying, we've done the best we can, here's our report, and we're diligent in this matter. And in order to make this even more visual, Denise, if you're there, we would love to show you a video that tries to make this clear, because an image is worth 1,000 words.
We all know that companies can have a big impact on people's lives. That impact can be good. That impact can also be bad. But no matter what, do companies have a responsibility to avoid hurting people? Yes. Since 2011, companies, NGOs, and governments have backed a global standard about businesses' responsibility to respect human rights, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The guiding principles are a critical but challenging standard to implement, especially in our interconnected global marketplace. Take one of these companies. Their products are designed by employees in the US, Europe, or Japan. They're manufactured by thousands of supplier companies in dozens of countries. Each one of these suppliers, in turn, has their own suppliers, doing everything from refining metals to molding plastics to packing products into shipping containers. Let's do the math about the people who can be impacted, in a good or bad way, by one of these companies' activities. That is a lot of people. How can a company respect all these people's human rights while still running its business? The company needs to prioritize. A company prioritizes by identifying its salient human rights issues, the human rights that are at risk of the most severe negative impact. That does not mean companies don't take action on other human rights issues, but it does mean they address the most salient human rights issues first. So how does a company identify its salient human rights issues? There are 3 factors to consider. Factor 1 is scale. This means the gravity of the human rights impact. This does not mean some human rights are more important than others. What scale means is how much someone's enjoyment of their right was set back as a result of what the company is doing. The worse the impact, the greater the scale. For example, in its 2015 report using the UN Guiding Principles Reporting Framework, Unilever identified forced labor as a salient human rights issue and provided detail about the scale of the impact. In its report, Unilever noted that migrant workers in particular high-risk industries are known to sometimes be sold into slavery, a grave impact of great scale. Factor 2 to determine a salient issue is scope. This means the number of people who are or could experience the negative impact on their human rights. For example, in its 2015 report using the UN Guiding Principles Reporting Framework, Ericsson identified the right to privacy as a salient human rights issue. Ericsson noted that many people around the world are increasingly concerned about multiple government surveillance using telecommunications networks, pointing to a broad scope for this issue. Factor 3 to determine a salient issue is remediability. Can the impact be put to right? For example, in Anglo American's 2014 Sustainable Development Report, the company highlighted health and safety issues as a top risk to people. In its reporting, Anglo American highlighted risks related to long-term occupational diseases and fatal work-related accidents. These kinds of impacts cannot be put to right and are thus irremediable. These 3 factors are how companies determine if a human rights issue is salient and should be prioritized for action and reporting. The companies in these examples are not only reporting their salient human rights issues, they are also taking action to reduce these risks. Learn more at ungpreporting.org.
What we would like to show is that how does it really works in practice, taking a company of the retail industry, for example. Maria?
Yes, let's have some fun. So basically what we thought about was to bring you here or to propose to dive in and think about a real life example of a company in the retail industry, because the retail industry presents multiple challenges. We called it a tale because this is a reflection and it's not based on any real life stories. But we wanted to help you understand better how to do and how to think about these abstract concepts more in practice in the context of a certain industry. So these are the 4 car components, car human rights processed components that Francisco just explained to you. And as he said, always start by identifying actual or potential adverse human rights risks or potential adverse impacts. And this is to say that you start by identifying your most salient human rights risks. Now, in the retailer industry, when you look at your business context and you consider, for example, your industry, you will realize that you are in an industry where your operations may have thousands of employees in different areas. But probably the biggest challenge concerning human rights issues will be your complex value chain. So basically, multiple layers of suppliers from different sectors, probably different geographies, and you cannot be sure, because you simply can't, if these business partners and if these suppliers, if they are all on the same page as you are in terms of values and in terms of treating their employees, and you have to do basically something to avoid being hit unexpectedly with modern slavery or a child labor scandal with all the inherent reputational damage to your company because it was in your value chain and you did not know. So after you do this, as Francisco was explaining, you have to look into scale, you have to look into scope and irremediability. Basically, as Francisco was stating, scale is about it's a qualitative criteria. So basically, you try to assess where are your most prominent human rights violations along your value chain. Is it modern slavery? Is it child labor? What do you want to avoid? Is it all of them together? And then you move into scope. So basically in scope, you try to assess how many people or which human rights violations will impact the most people. Maybe you decide that according to the geographies where your supply chains are, there is historically an issue of child labor, and it is possible that these suppliers of yours might be using children to produce the products that they then ship to you. So basically, this would be the second reflection that you need to do in practice to identify your salient human rights issues. And then last but not least, of course, irremediability. So basically, and circling back to Francisco's example, the best example I think we can give you is, okay, can I do something? Can I change something in my operations, in my internal procedures to prevent this human rights violations from happening? Can I still avoid that children's rights being violated, that these communities' health are taken care of? If the answer is no, you should first look into human rights issues or risks where you can have a preventive approach, where you can actually avoid the violation from happening or from keeping happening. So basically, that would be the third criteria used to conclude this reflection. Moving on, integrating your findings across relevant company processes. This would mean a top-down human rights policy, many other HR procedures, and of course, ensuring that in your company you have a human rights process owner or external advisory to ensure that all governance, public and internal commitments are actually being implemented. Procurement criteria are being used to select and hire your suppliers and your business partners. You have an M&A human rights policy where before you buy or sell your company, especially when you buy, you perform a human rights due diligence to ensure that what you're buying is not toxic with human rights violations, and before you buy it, you can do something about it. Then it's also about having contractual clauses. So basically, your business partners, your suppliers, when you do hire them, being aware that you have a very prominent stand on these issues, and that if they want to work with you, they have to agree on certain minimum standards and conditions. And finally, of course, certifications such as the B Corp certification, networks like the United Nations Global Compact are all helpful instruments to integrate findings on your actual or potential adverse human rights companies across your company processes. Moving on, tracking the effectiveness of measures. Basically, you would need a multidisciplinary task force, especially in a company that works in the retail industry. You'll have multiple teams that in one way or another may have a positive or negative impact on this front. So you should probably set up a team with someone from the compliance team, someone from sustainability team, someone from the procurement team, and other teams to make sure that whatever is agreed upon and publicly committed to on from the top is actually being understood and implemented throughout the company. Finally, ongoing training is also very helpful, and concerning your value chain, in local visits and or NGO visits and reports who work in this area are also helpful. Circling back to our example of a company in the retail industry, basically, if my supplier is in Nepal or India, probably it is not reasonable that I have the resources, especially depending on my dimension, to go in there and actually monitor and make sure that the commitments that they undertook with me concerning the way they treat their employees, they are being respected. But luckily, there are a lot of international NGOs nowadays where that companies can pair up to and make this monitoring in loco to ensure that across their value chains, even when they operate in different geographies, commitments on human rights are actually being respected. And finally, communication. Communication, accountability, transparency. This is very, very important. Communication on progress, how you're tackling these issues, what your due diligence process is when things go wrong, what you have learned from that experience, how did you try to compensate and remedy victims that suffered from human rights violations that you directly or indirectly contributed to, sustainability reports, and finally, communication is also an excellent tool to share best practices and ensure that a whole industry mindset on this matter changes. So this is highly recommendable. And finally, a final thought, just to tell you that as Francisco said earlier, this is a dynamic process. This is not a static process. Things change all the time at a super rapid rhythm. And so every company who wants to dive into this and who wants to take a stand on these issues should face them like they are, an ongoing management process that they should be always revisiting and rethinking and aiming at learning from and doing better. This is a journey. It's definitely not button that you switch on or switch off according to where if you care or you do not care to the matter. So the final surprise we had for you is actually a video that we hope will inspire all of you. Because when Francisco and we think about human rights, the immediate word that comes out of our head is care. It is because we care for peoples, for communities, for more than each other that probably we are gathered here today. And this surprise we had for you is basically a poem on this word, on care. We find it really inspiring, and we thought about sharing it, a small part of this poem with you before we leave, because we think it might really motivate you to spread the word and contribute to this mindset change.
Care is a four-letter word, until we lay the pieces in. Fill it up with the hopes and dreams we hide away for those we love. Familiar faces, arms reached out, heart, hearth, and home warmed up by the kinetic energy we pass back and forth on the tail end of a smile. The spellbinding laughter that wraps you up, your double-jointed arms spread out just a few degrees too far, embracing the one you cherish. Care is a gift and a promise. A gift from those before us, and a promise to those who follow. It is here between us, in every room across the planet waiting, hoping to be called upon by each of us. Care is love. The love a stranger offers you, if only an homage to our shared humanity. Care is our nourishers, the ones who plucked us up from our darkest days, dusted the scrapes off, healed away the hurt this world can bring. There is more to wanting better than wanting better for yourself. The thing that makes us who we are is how we carry one another, even when there is no other reason than we are here in that same moment, on the same planet, and that means something. Care is a call to all mankind to help the earth know her name again. Care is a service to our communities, our environments, service to a future where hope truly is eternal, because we worked for it, we advocated and built a way to it, and will make that journey together. I gave up the will to fight only to have that same will offered back up to me by every gentle stranger, every willing mind, and the ones I love without worry, without question. Care is the promises we keep, my grandpa's gnarled hands, the seeds he carried in his waist belt. Care is a reminder that someone planned for the winter ahead. We still keep his souvenirs from the harvest season up on the window of his old room. Care is a choice that brings...
Very good. I think we can move forward to some of the questions. Luisa, would you like to start with the questions that were addressed to the EIB, or would you like us to start?
You're submitted.
I think you should address the questions, pick a couple of them, since we are already running over time, and the other ones which are on organizational issues, I will then send a message.
Great.
So,
Francisco, do you want to start, or should I start? Yes, good. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So we have a comment regarding incoherent patchwork of laws in the EU, which is a very great comment, because as we've been seeing in the United Nations Guiding Principles, established international legislation through soft law, but this was a United Nations measure. And because the EU took its normal time to keep up with mandatory human rights due diligence, what actually happened was that member states, in an independent fashion, became approving their own legislation regarding human rights due diligence. And although the EU had a couple of norms regarding human rights, especially in the report dimension, what happened is that the UK, the Netherlands, France, now we see the case of Germany, they independently approved for their own state legislation. And what happened was, and this is why the EU legislation that is coming is so critical, is that you have, as our participant so elaborately put it, an incoherent patchwork of laws, and then there are many consequences to this, including the shopping of legal systems by companies, where they can understand where the human rights due diligence is in place and where it is not. So it's a great comment, and we hope that with the approval of the EU legislation, this is going to be solved. And I think that is the hopes of the EU itself. I have another answer prepared, Maria, if you want me to keep on going.
Yes, I would like to comment on the question, but then you can just pick up on what I'm saying. Probably you were going to say something similar too. The question about disabilities and how and if or how you can include this in your due diligence process. Of course, this is an issue that should be integrated and should be considered in any human rights policy, and how to integrate this not only in the operations of our own company, but also the kind of commitments we want our value chain to take upon in this area of diversity and inclusion. So I would say that we are not only talking about people with disabilities, human rights, but also, as someone put it in a comment below, minorities. No, so basically make sure that we have, as a company, an inclusive hiring and then hiring policy that then ensures that all their workers and its employees are treated equally and fairly, and are ensured their own rights, regardless if they are part of a minority group because they are disabled, because they are a woman, because of their sexual orientation, whatever the reason may be. So yes, the answer is totally yes, and I think you can do this in a twofold way. So basically, you can look at the issue internally in terms of how you want to address it in your own operations, and be more, of course, demanding in that sense, and reflect some criteria in your human rights policy, in your human resources policy, whatever you have that states your commitment in terms of diversity and inclusion within your own company. And then looking at that, see what for you are the minimum standards or commitments you would like your business partners or your suppliers to uphold because they are in business with you. And so, yes, so this is definitely something that can come up in that first step that we tackled here today of identifying human rights salient risks. And this is definitely something you can integrate in the process of your businesses, either internally or externally towards your value chain. I think those were the main comments and questions. I'm not sure, Francisco, if you saw another relevant we should take on.
There is another very interesting question that it's very hard, but it says industrial trade is one of the most severe areas in Africa where human rights violence takes place. If women would senior positions in these big companies, can we reduce these issues? It's a complicated question with more than a legal perspective. But what we can advance is that the integration of women in the boards is part of a decent human rights due diligence process, because as Media pointed out, there is a strong relation between business and human rights and diversity and inclusion. From a legal perspective, there is a principle in international law called the principle of non-discrimination, and this is also a human right. So in the EU, it's forbidden to discriminate in reference to the gender, and also women have the right to equal treatment. So you have a double legal construct from a negative side, the prohibition of discrimination, and from a positive side, the guarantee of legal treatment. So in this sense, diversity and inclusion is frameable within human rights. And if it is frameable within human rights, then it belongs within a proper policy of business in human rights, because we have a human right to equality. From a very scientific perspective, equality is not only a human right, it's also a principle of international law. So it's very transversal to the system. So in that case, I guess there is a dimension of women empowerment in this.
And beyond the law, I would just like to add that you are absolutely right. I mean, you have several studies today that demonstrate that there is what they called a diversity dividend, and that companies that ensure diversity in their boards, in their workforce, they do better, they perform better financially, they do better overall, because it's true. I mean, being different is a great thing for companies, because it brings to the table different perspectives, and those different perspectives bring different added value. And so if you can make sure that you have both women and men represented in senior positions of your company, if you can ensure that within your workforce you value and you integrate different kinds of minorities, there are studies that it's not me saying, I mean, today it's proven that you will do better, you will perform better financially and economically. And so yes, I really believe that if more women held senior positions in big companies that can have an impact in Africa in this industry, probably these issues would be much less. And unfortunately, what we see is that the gender equality issue is being tackled from different perspectives, different angles, different stakeholders. And there seems to be a push, an international push and joint effort in trying to tackle it and to overcome it. So maybe we will see the reality in Africa in industrial trade also change in the next few years.
Okay, I think we are running so late. So I will really, this is really an example of a topic that was a very important topic for social entrepreneurs, for enterprises in general, for businesses. And the fact that we are running late just shows how
it's a good sign.
Fascinating.
As long as the people are still with us.
Yes, they are. Important topic. So I would just like to thank you, Maria and Francisco, for a very, very exciting webinar, a very lively one. And to the participants, we'll be sharing a survey. Please let us know what other topics you would like to see. And we have some other forthcoming webinars with Francisco and Maria on related topics. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Luisa, for the opportunity. It was great. Thank you so much.
So stay tuned for the next ones. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.